Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we welcome artist and Professor Krishna Sadasivam. Luckily, I'm joined by friends today, so I don't really need to introduce myself for those that are watching on Zoom or viewing at home. I'm Sarah Felice, the curator of the Winnipeg Museum of Art. I do want to mention that this is actually my first faculty exhibition with the museum, and I've been very lucky to get to know Krishna and his work over the last few months. It's been an honor and a pleasure. So thank you for joining us today. Krishna was born in Winnipeg, Canada, and moved to the US when he was 7 years old. He was raised in a staunchly conservative South Indian household where rock music was held in disdain. His creative diet was instead fed by a copious collection of funny animal comic books and Saturday morning cartoons. In his early teens, he discovered MTV, where his exposure to Western music blossomed and grew. He studied electrical and computer engineering at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he earned his bachelor's and master's degrees. After 4 years in the chip design industry, he left the field and earned his M.F.A. in animation from the Savannah College of Art and Design. Fabulous museum. He's worked as a professional illustrator for 20 years with clients including Microsoft, the Smithsonian Museum of Art, Bandai Namco, and more. In addition to a steady stream of client work, he teaches as a full-time professor within the digital media department at St. Petersburg College. He and his family have lived in Tampa for over 17 years. And I have to say, when you wrote and you talked about your teaching philosophy, as someone who's worked in education throughout my life in various capacities, your statement actually resonated the most with me. And yeah, it just was a pleasure. And I have to talk a little bit about just your core principles in teaching. And this I have highlighted actually, which is very important. Growth is developmental and requires time, patience, hard work, and discipline. We are the shepherds of our own growth. And I like to say that we are all the captains of our own ship and our own journey. As instructors, we must focus on our strengths and use positive reinforcement to help learners grow academically, socially, and emotionally. You also believe critical thinking helps students internalize their learning and is absolutely essential for student success in solving challenging design problems. Instructors must constantly seek renewal and growth, both in teaching and professional experience. And I think that's not true across the board. You know, I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily believe the same way, but I couldn't have said it more perfectly. Design is so important. Yeah, absolutely. Everything's changing all the time right now. Diversity, trust, and unity must be encouraged and fostered within the classroom, 100%. Structure and shared decision-making are significant to the learning process. We are all learners. Eliminating the teacher and student hierarchy in the classroom and treating everyone as aspiring professionals provides a conductive, respectful, and positive learning environment that both engages and accentuates learning. And as someone who's been only one learner, that was really important to me as a student. So I appreciate that approach. We learn better when we laugh. Never underestimate the power of humor. So it is my honor and pleasure to welcome Krishna Sadasivam.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to say, first of all, I'm very grateful and appreciative that the Winnipeg Museum has invited me to go ahead and speak and share my work with everybody. So Sarah did a wonderful introduction, so I'm just going to go ahead and start off with some work. A lot of my influences stem from a voracious love of pop culture. I also really like old school comic books. I still read comic books, don't judge me. I find them to be a fascinating storytelling medium. So these are some of the clients that I've done work for over the years. I'm going to share a little bit about how I got into this, because as Sarah read in the bio, I started out studying electrical engineering, and that wasn't really by choice. It was more of like, you can't be an artist. You have to actually do something that's going to make money. And what am I going to tell my friends if my son's a starving artist? This was literally, I'm quoting my mom verbatim when I go ahead and mention this. So to come to this point and to actually be able to share my work with the public at large is a truly fabulous honor. These are some photos that were taken at our faculty gallery show that took place a few months ago. And then also at the Dunedin Fine Arts Center, I had a piece that was listed over there. So as I mentioned, I started out studying electrical engineering. And the reason for that was because I'm good with computers. This is what my mom said. So I did not like math. So to undercut any kind of Asian American stereotype, I was not a math person. I was more of an art and English person. But apparently, based upon our society at large and the Indian population at large, math was what you're supposed to be. You could only choose between being a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And so those are really some fabulous choices to choose from. I didn't want to do biology because I hated dissection. So engineering was the closest thing. Fun fact, I kind of grew to like certain parts of engineering. And I think that everything that we learn in life has some kind of an influence on us as we get older. So looking back, I think it was the right decision to go ahead and do that route because it made me way more appreciative of what I can do now. And studying something like engineering was really difficult. But the fact that I could do that and do it well, despite the fact that I didn't really care for it, meant that if I really cared about something enough, I could do great in it. And so that's the reason why I decided to go ahead and pursue. I left the chip industry after about 4 years. I worked for 2 companies. The first was in Orlando called Lockheed Martin. And then I worked for a company called LSI Logic in Raleigh, North Carolina. So I did that for about 4 years. I was about 29 years old at the time. And then there was the dot-com bust that happened in 2000. And it gave me an opportunity to do a little bit of soul searching. And what I realized in that moment is that I have 2 paths that I can go on. I can continue to get jobs as an engineer and get that nice steady paycheck and kind of live my life under my parents' terms, or I could actually risk it all and see what happens. And I chose the latter, and I'm so thankful for it because there are moments when you're young where you kind of, at least for me, I projected what it would have been like to be in my 40s doing something that I absolutely hated. And I just could not see myself being happy. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take a chance. And my dad was very supportive. My mom, tried to bribe, beg, cajole me to do. She's like, why don't you just stick with it? Do that as a hobby. And I'm like, I don't want to. And so that was like my punk rock move right there. Just like, I'm going to go back to school. So I left Raleigh, North Carolina, sold my home there. And it was about this time that I met my wife. And so when I'd met her, she was in India. And, so we were kind of doing internet dating before internet dating became cool. And so I was working as an engineer. And then somewhere shortly after our engagement, our design center closed. So here she was getting ready to come over to the United States to get married to an unemployed engineer. But she came anyway, which is great. Because I told her what my plans were. I'm like, I'm going to go back to school. And I went to get my M.F.A. at the Savannah College of Art and Design. I remember our first night together in Savannah. So we'd just been married at that point for about a month and a half. And we were in a hotel. Wasn't exactly a glamorous hotel, let me tell you. You could hear people screaming and all sorts of scary stuff. And I'm sure she was like, what the hell did I just get myself into? But somehow we prevailed. That was the right move. I felt everything was right. When I started taking my first classes, I realized that I was among my tribe. And I can't tell you how important that is to know that you're part of your tribe, because as an engineer, let me tell you, I felt like a fish out of water. I would talk about my art. I would talk about things that interested me. And I would just get all these looks of like puzzlement, like, what is that? And I kind of felt like an outsider or a square peg in a round hole. So when I was working as an engineer, this was in Orlando, I started a comic called The PC Weenies. And this was really my foray into learning how to draw and make webcomics. So this is the very first PC Weenies comic that I published on the internet in 1998. Now I was doing this kind of like on the side. So I'd do my engineering day job. I'd come back home. I had just procured a Wacom tablet. I had a Mac. And I had Photoshop. I didn't know how to use anything. There was no YouTube. I didn't even think about classes at that point. This is just me trying to figure out how to make this stuff work. So you can see it's pretty awful. But I put it up on the internet. I learned how to make a website. And then the next day, someone who was not my family member said, I like that. When is the next one coming out? And I'm like, holy blank, someone's actually reading this? So I had an audience of one. That was not anyone that I knew. So I started making webcomics and I did this for about 20 years. And in that process of doing something over and over again, you get better. So the very first sketch of Bob, who's my little favorite character. He's a complete tech weenie. He's a nerd. And you can see this is what he kind of looked like. I actually captured this from my sketchbook. And it's not that great. There's, I wish all my art students were here because they can totally roast me for how terrible these things are. But you got to start somewhere. And that's what I did. And then later on, as I continued to practice, I started to learn more about Photoshop and digital drawing. And I was completely self-taught by this point in time, just trying to get information wherever I could get it. There were no books on digital art at all. So it was really kind of making mistakes and learning from them. I discovered layers, by the way, in Photoshop. I'm embarrassed to admit this 4 years after using Photoshop. So someone was like, why are you just putting everything on one layer? I'm like, what do you mean? There's more than one layer? And that was like a revelation, let me tell you. But, I can also credit Scott Kelby, who ran the first Photoshop users conference in Orlando. And I took 3 days off of my engineering job just to go and see what it was like. And it was at that point that I saw a vision of what my future could be. These gentlemen and ladies were complete wizards with Photoshop, and my mouth was agape the entire 3 days that I was there. And it was at that moment that I knew that this is what I need to do with my life. And I'm so glad that I made the switch. So here's a later comic. I think I did this in 2022. So you can just see how this cartoon series has evolved. It started out as a multi-panel comic, then it went to a single panel comic for a number of years, and then it evolved into a multi-panel comic again. And over that time, I've just refined and honed and just tried to get better and better at this. And the thing about being an artist is your journey is never really over. You're just constantly in a state of learning something new. And that's what I love about it. This is a medium where you constantly feel challenged, you constantly grow. And I think if I told my 21-year-old self what I'm creating now, I don't think that person would have believed me. But the thing is, I just kept on going after it. Here's another one here too. Hopefully these are some relatable. I kind of think Bob is kind of like my alter ego. Bob is that little guy there with the little white tufts of hair. That was my first real attempt at making my own cartoon character. Something that I've grown to love this character and his family over a period of time. And I actually made a book. And this is something that I'm also really proud of too, because I didn't know how to make a book. And I wanted to make a book, and I talked to people that had made books, and I put together my own book, and it was a big learning process. I didn't know the first thing about what I was doing. I was just relying heavily on people that have already done this before. I had all the files sent out to China. They shipped over a pallet of books, and I've got some of those books that are over here on the side. And I did Kickstarter before Kickstarter was even a thing. I just basically asked my audience. At that point, I was getting about 2,500 readers a day coming in. And they were like, yeah, we'd like to support your book. So they actually paid money ahead of time with the promise that I would deliver a book. And I'm fortunate to say that this book has been on all 7 continents. It's been to Antarctica. I will never go to Antarctica. I hate the cold, but my book is there, and some of my atoms are in Antarctica, and also at the peak of Mount Uhuru in Africa. So if you've ever hiked on a mountain, you know that you can only bring a few things. You can't bring a comic book, but Dan Hernandez did. And that was so cool of him to take a picture with the book in Antarctica. And that, this is something that I never made something before. So you just have to put it out there in the universe. You just have to just try. If I didn't try, the easy path could have been, that's too hard, I'm going to give up. But then I couldn't share these wonderful experiences with all of you. So it goes on a little bit later on. So at some point, this is Richard Rawlings from the hit TV show Fast and Loud. He is a huge automotive personality. And several years ago, I happened to be, my wife and I and my daughter were going to Maui for vacation. And we stopped by at a Dallas airport to a Gas Monkey garage rail. There was a restaurant. And my daughter kind of half jokingly said, wouldn't it be great if we met Richard Rawlings? And I'm like, yeah, that'll never happen. It's like, this is his restaurant. He's never here. So we end up flying to Maui. We book a helicopter trip. And on our when we're processing our payment and getting our souvenirs, my daughter nudged me. She's like, that's Richard Rawlings. And I kind of look, I couldn't see his face. And I'm like, yeah, that guy looks like Richard Rawlings, but that's not Richard Rawlings. And he turned around and I'm like, had my fanboy moment. So that conversation led to me actually creating some work that has, that he has in his Gas Monkey garage. I guess it's now like a car museum, but he still does work out there. And even on episodes of Fast and Loud, I've taken some screen caps of some of my work that is hanging in his space, which is pretty awesome. So that's, again, where I just rolled the dice on the universe. I met him, and then I came back to my home, and I was just drawing something in tribute. He happened to see it on Instagram, and then I was able to go ahead and send him my work and get that, huge promotion. So that was pretty awesome. I've also done some work for Cartoons Magazine. Cartoons Magazine is a hot rod magazine, comics really for the hot rod enthusiasts. I've always loved cars. I've loved die-cast cars since I was a kid. And now I love bigger cars, but die-cast cars are what I can afford. So I go crazy with the Hot Wheels. So here's some process of a comic strip. So this is a black and white. It's on newsprint. And you can see some rough sketches. And then you can see the finished piece on the right-hand side. So I wrote, I lettered. I use a lot of references when I'm drawing things like dune buggies and stuff. And I use some halftone effects here to go ahead and create my work. And that was a really great experience too, because that was another bucket list item that I wanted to do. I wanted to get published in Cartoons Magazine. And a friend of mine happened to say, hey, I know the editor. This was, again, through social media. And Mark Method was the editor, and he reached out. I expressed my interest. He's like, okay, well, I'll give you 3 pages. Let's see what you can do with it. So I was in like 7 or 8 issues of Cartoons Magazine, which was available at Barnes and Nobles, et cetera. So that was kind of cool too, walking in and saying, hey, that's my stuff. Last year, I was involved with a book. I contributed an essay as well as a 3-page comic for Rise, which is actually went on the New York Times bestseller list. It was number 11. And I played a very small role in that, in helping the writers out with, they were trying to collect the Asian American experience from different people. And, you would write essays. This is actually, it's kind of ironic. If you buy this book, or if you look at this book at a bookstore, you will see a baby picture of me getting my first haircut. So that is there. And also, I talk a lot about my experience growing up as an Asian kid in Canada and US, but I was also given the opportunity to go ahead and illustrate a 3-page comic that another Asian American writer wrote about her challenge work, being a kid and doing the spelling bees. So these are just some process shots. This is like the unlettered sample on the left and the lettered sample on the right-hand side. So that comic also appears as a gatefold pull-out from the book itself. So that was a really cool honor to be a part of. These are the tools that I use to create my stuff. I've got a Wacom Cintiq 27-inch model that's on my desk. I've got a MacBook Pro, the very one that I'm using right here, and lots of coffee, because I love my coffee. And I use Photoshop these days. I've used a wide number of tools like Clip Studio Paint and other tools like that, but it's like Photoshop is the one that I know all the hotkeys, and I just feel most comfortable with it. So I've been using that pretty much. These are just some of the influences that I have. I mean, comic books. I was a huge Roadrunner and Coyote fan. I grew up in the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner hour. And I knew that theme song every time the little overture march where Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck are kind of dancing on stage. That was my jam. And I remember that was one of the few cartoons that came on as a primetime cartoon at 5 p.m. on a Saturday. So I took the TV at that point, and I was obsessed with those characters. That's what really led me to the love of drawing. I would sit parked in front of the big Zenith wood grain TV that we had. We had color, and I would just take my art pads and I would just have all my crayons, and I would try to draw the Roadrunner and Coyote And I still have a huge fondness for those characters. And of course, I like a lot of like pop movies like James Bond and things like that too. Here's a couple of process stages. This is what I would call my digital inks. So everything that I do is done in a digital format. I have worked in an analog format. Sometimes I'll draw something digitally and I will print it out in blue line and I'll ink it traditionally. But when my daughter was really small, we had an episode with ink and carpets and dining chairs. So that really put the kibosh on any kind of traditional tools. I mean, now she's 15, so I think it's safe to bring out the inks again. But she painted in her own way. So I've been working digitally, actually 100% digitally now for like the last 10 years. And I still like my traditional media, but now I just need more space to go ahead and create that. It becomes a production to set everything up, but this is just a file and it lives on my computer. So it's more transportable. So you have the inks here and then the color flat stage. This is basically where I apply flat color to the drawing. And what I try to think about when I'm using color is, where do I want the viewer's eyes to go to? So this is an example of what I call a montage. Montage is like a collage, but it implies a narrative. So you can see here that your eye is moving around the composition, and it should do that with the line art itself. And the color is just to accentuate that. The color just, reinforces the focal point. And I'm using a combination of warm and cool colors to create this. And here's the final version where I'm now starting to think about subtle effects to kind of enhance the final art. So, my art is very pop art based. I make no apologies for that. I love what I love. And, everyone should love what they love. So here's, I recorded a couple of videos here that will actually show you the process of me actually drawing. So I'm going to go ahead and see if this will actually play. And this first one is done in real time and the other two are sped up. So I'm just making 3 videos. Each video shows a part of the process. So this is just I just gave myself like roughly 5 minutes just to go ahead and quickly sketch something out. And you can see here that I work with layers. I always start out working in red because later on when I have to go back and ink, it's easier to see where I've missed if I'm using a different color besides black. Like if I use black inks, it's kind of hard to, black pencils, it's hard to see where my inks. So, I start out with just first of all, defining a shape. These are the things that I teach in my digital drawing class at SPC. So the students this term are learning about how to go ahead and use form and how to go ahead and create value through this black and white with inks. And they're also having a digital coloring unit where they learn the basics of hue, saturation, complementary colors, as well as learning about things like contrast. These are all really important things. So I didn't speed this up, but watching it, I kind of feel like I want to speed it up, but it's not that much longer. But the idea is that I don't do details until the very end. I start with the form and make sure the form is right, check the proportions, and then from there I start to build to something that has a little bit more detail. So in the spirit of Halloween, I decided to create a mummy. So that's what you're seeing here. Okay, so the question is, does every student have a Wacom tablet? We have Wacom tablets that are available for students to use. We also have Surface Studios. Those that are online do end up having to purchase a Wacom tablet. Yeah, so that is kind of an important tool for digital drawing.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, the difference in for the audio, but the difference in trying to just your mouse versus that is like, it's almost maddening.
Yes.
To have to do this.
Drawing, the one thing that I wish I had taken a better picture of is the tablet itself, because it includes a pen-like device called a stylus. And that stylus mimics the feel of using a pencil. It's, for those of you that have not drawn digitally, the experience is akin to drawing on glass, because that's what you're doing. You're essentially drawing on glass. Whereas if you're using charcoal on paper, you can feel the texture of the paper. You can feel the friction of the charcoal pencil moving against the canvas. This doesn't afford that. That's the one area where I think it kind of loses out to me. I miss the tactility, but I like the portability. So for me, that makes sense. So, oh, sorry, well, hit play again. So this is a sped up version of me going back through. So what I've done is I've simply dropped the opacity of what we call now the underdrawing. That's my pencil drawing. And now I'm going back through and I'm starting to clean up. I like to think of inking as kind of, it's embellishing. The term embellishment means to add to. So a good inker will actually enliven what is already there. And in comic books, typically one person will pencil, one person will ink, one person will color. And in this case, it's like I'm doing all three. So for me, inking is like an improvisational jam. I know what I'm inking over, so I can kind of play around with it. I can take some liberties with that work. I have inked other people before, and other people have inked me. And it's kind of, some people can do it okay, and some people can't. It's kind of like you're handing off your baby to somebody else, and you just hope they take care of it as the way you're taking care of it. And some of them do, a lot of them don't. So you can see here where I'm adding some shading here, and the hatching here conveys different values. So one of the things we talk about in the digital drawing class is being able to convey value, which is a range from white to black with grayscales in between, using only black and white. And the way that you can do that is through line thickness as well as line placement. And this video, I begin to color. And the way I approach color is I start out with some kind of a flat color. I make a selection and I fill that entire area, and I simply jump layers. So what I'm doing is I'm selecting that red that you're seeing here is a base color, and I'm using the magic wand tool to select portions of the drawing and then duplicating the selection onto its own layer and then using the hue saturation. It's a very fast way of working. And so something like this in real time probably did take me about 5 minutes to go ahead and do. So one of the things that I really try to espouse with my students is not only learning the techniques, but also being able to be more efficient with them. If they're having to do the same task multiple times, there's probably a more efficient way of doing it. So that's what I try to share with my students. So that's the final color version of that. I've got a website and I've got an Instagram. And one of the things that I've been doing as an educator is allowing students to, I've got a YouTube channel where I produce a lot of content that will help everybody out in the world. But the students also have access to that as well. And I've made specific videos for my students for their classes so they can get the benefit of both worlds. They get more nuanced instruction, but they can also watch these additional videos should they need to get any extra clarification. All right, so that's pretty much all I have to say. I guess I'll open it for questions and answers. Maybe I'll get some answers. Yeah, you in the back. Yes.
What, Krishna, can you explain to the audience your method for not giving up?
Well, failure is not an option. And you can't win if you don't try. And that's the thing. It's like when you're learning something for the first time, you're not going to be good at it. And the analogy that I always like to give to my students is that when we were all babies, we didn't know how to walk. We saw everybody walking around us, and somehow we had the will to walk, if you will. So we started to climb onto things. We started to hold objects, and we took our first steps. We didn't know that we couldn't fail. That's the kind of mentality that we should inculcate in ourselves so that we can be successful. As we get older, we start to put more barriers on our success. We start to talk ourselves out of it. We start to rationalize. But can you imagine a baby doing that? You know what? This walking thing, it's way too hard. I think I'm going to pram it. 42 years later, still being pushed in the pram, right? So we don't have that spirit of giving up then. And, for me, it was a huge life change. I can't tell you how scared I was leaving. Like, I had engineering friends that were like, hey, we can hook you up. There are jobs in the area. You can keep your house. You don't have to sell anything. I literally have my manager from an engineering company that I work for. We went out for my farewell dinner, and he just looked like he was just like putting me out to pasture, like I was going to die. Like it was just one of those things where it's like, I'm so sorry for you. And, you know, I didn't feel that way. I felt liberated. I felt like, you know, this is my life. I want to live it the way I want to live it. And I think that so many people, I get a lot of emails from, younger kids, but also people that are my age that are coming from an Asian background that are feeling such frustration because they've bought into that whole idea that they need to do what their parents want them to do, but they're trading what their parents like for them to do for their own misery. They're deeply unhappy. And I'm just so glad that I had the foresight to change because I wanted to change. I wanted to try this out. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't be here speaking with you. I'd be sitting in a cubicle writing some program somewhere. Thank God. I don't know if that answers your question, Barbara.
You'd be shocked how many software engineers and developers feel the same way. Like it's having family now in software engineering. Like I see it. My partner has a friend who usually went off to just tend to sheep for the rest of his, and so he like just raises sheep and cows in the middle of the woods with no internet. And
he's probably so happy.
He's having the time of his life. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely important. And, you know, then the question might be, well, why do you teach? And the way I look at it is teaching for me is like being on a mountain. And I think Jessica's heard this, so I apologize, Jessica, if you've already heard this story, but, you know, we have to go down to where the students are at, and we have to bring them up. We can't expect them to meet us halfway on the mountain. We have to go down to the base camp and bring them up. And then our job is to continue to, we're the Sherpas. We're taking them up to an elevation of 1,000. And then it's like, all right, that's the trail. You got to go on. You know how to climb now, so you got to go up to the summit. So on the one sense, it's like, maybe myself, I'll never reach that summit, but I had students that have reached that summit. So in some way, I've reached the summit. Does that make sense? So it's really empowering when you look at it that way. It's pretty cool.
This is one understanding myself a little bit about some of the subculture difference. Yeah, where in South India is you?
Chennai.
I was going to ask you if you were from Chennai.
Yep.
Because it's a very like this is the way things are, and this is how you do it, right?
Yeah, so, it's very traditional. Yeah. And what I think is interesting about Indian culture is I think the people that are in Chennai are probably a little bit more liberated. I think those folks that left India in the 60s and 70s felt like they were carrying their tradition with them. So that is why they are more conservative, because it speaks to the culture that they have left. Because I went back to Bombay about 10 years ago, and I'm just like, you know, we went out to, you know, Bombay's like the New York of India. And it's just like, whoa, like, what are these people wearing? It's like, do their parents know that they're wearing that? And it's like, well, that's just the kids. They don't know about this because they're just in that culture. The culture is with them all the time. But because we're kind of like the Indian diaspora, we're kind of away. So I think the parents feel more of a push to, they have to bring the Indian culture in. They have to preserve it so that it can be passed down, because it's not going to be easily passed down in a vacuum. You know, when you're in Knoxville, Tennessee, for example, not exactly a place for Indian people, right? So.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's my only hope is that someone maybe listening to this at some point will have the courage to make a decision and to just, you know, do what they want to do.
I saw you had that first book. It looked like you did it 1,000 years ago. You know Amazon published it, and I know you can publish a book at a time. So when's the second edition of the CD?
Oh my gosh. Well, I've already prepared the second book, but it's just been shelved for a long period of time. So the book is there, but other things in life got in the way, but it is there. And I've learned so much. You know, the thing is, here's what I've also learned too. You think that most people won't help you out, but you just have to ask them. And you show a spirit of being genuine, they will help you. I mean, I thought initially some of these other cartoonist peers of mine would be very much like, I'm not going to tell you how to do it. But they were like, what do you need? We'll help you. And I think that was that's the spirit I think that everyone really should have. Because then it's like, you're not in direct competition with them. They've got their own audience. They're not worried about, you know, me stealing their audience because I'm talking about a completely different subject than they are. And that's the way I like to think about teaching too. I've literally been told by professionals, I can't show you how I do that. And I'm like, why? Because that's my secret. And like, what are you, Superman or something? It's like, so I will reverse engineer it and I will tell everybody. Because I think that if someone is so beholden to having that as a crutch, that says a lot more about their weaknesses than their strengths. Give it away. You know, share it with everybody. I have an open door policy with students. It's like, you want to ask me anything that I've done? Ask. I'll help you out. I'm not going to, you know, I want you to be better than me. And, you know, but I think some people view that as kind of a threat. And there really is no threat. They're not competing with me. They're competing against themselves like we all are. Great questions. Do you have a question or
all this, I watched my granddaughter.
Like
this. I watched the exhibit here.
It is a refreshing way to work. If you have not tried digital art, all you need is a tablet and all you need is a drawing software. You don't need something as expensive as Photoshop. I think many folks have an iPad, they have the pencil, and they have a program called Procreate, which is like $5 or $10. What a time that we live in where something like this, I know the iPad is expensive, but relatively speaking, it's significantly cheaper than what it was 20 years ago. And the fact that someone can just sit and draw wherever they want to and share their work with the world at large, I think that's pretty awesome. And so it's never been a better time to get involved with it. And there's so many great resources. There's so many people that are sharing their knowledge online. I think my, 13 or 14-year-old self would have just killed for a future where I could be learning from the pros every single day. I was the type of person that would go to the public library and I would be at the art section. I was looking for a book on how to draw comic strips, looking for anything. And at that point, graphic novels were a taboo. Comic books or graphic novels were, librarians would just scoff at you. They'd be like, oh, comic books, we're not, this is a highbrow place. Now I see graphic novels prevalent everywhere. And I think that people are finally coming down to the idea that comics are more than just superheroes. You can tell some pretty powerful stories. It is visual storytelling, right? Just like movies are. So I think that, now people are awakening to the idea that comics can be a sophisticated visual medium. So, I'm happy that things have changed. But I just wish I had a time machine. So, anything else? Thank you all. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. Turn the podium back to Sarah.
Thank you. Have a cookie, please.
Never recorded.